Hello and welcome to the Reserve Funding Analyzer. In this video I'm going to be discussing reserve funding, just the basics. I'm Steve Beisel. I'm the developer of the Reserve Funding Analyzer, which is an application for developing a funding plan for an HOA. As the president of my own HOA, I developed the RFA so we could analyze our reserve funding and develop a sound plan for implementation. The RFA provides the means for you to develop a reserve funding plan for your own HOA, even if you are not a financial analyst. So, when developing a reserve funding plan, what do you need to know? Well, here's some basics. First, we're going to talk about the fully funded balance and percent funding. What it is, how is it calculated, why is it important. Talk about the funding methodologies, full baseline statutory and threshold funding, and a short discussion about the percent funding and the special risk, a special assessment risk that is correlated to the actual percent funding, and how to understand what this risk is and to balance it against the actual funding themselves. Okay? So what does it mean to be fully funded? Well, or also known as the fully funded balance. Well, a reserve account is considered fully funded if there's enough money added to reserve components every year so that there's enough money to replace the components or perform the required maintenance. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. The formula for calculating the fully funded balance is the current component cost times the effective age divided by the component useful life. Now, this doesn't account for inflation, but that's the basic formula. So, as an example, if an association's roof costs $100,000 and has a useful life of 10 years, when the roof is brand new, the fully funded balance is zero. And you need to save $10,000 a year for the next 10 years to cover replacement cost. Again, this is discounting inflation. If the roof is 5 years old now, then the fully funded balance is $50,000. But if you only have $25,000 in the reserve balance, then you are only 50% funded. And when the roof is 8 years old, it will be 80% deteriorated, and its fully funded balance would be $80,000. So if you've only saved $20,000 by year 8, you would only be 25% funded, and you have a deficit of $60,000. Now, here is the formula that takes the fully funded balance and accounts for inflation. So this is for your information. Okay, moving on. The roof example. And consider a clubhouse roof that costs $100,000, has a useful life of 10 years. When it's brand new, the start of year reserve fund is zero. However, the reserve fund expenses don't occur on this roof until year 10, and then they occur at year 20 and year 30. And the reserve contributions of $10,000 per year are required so that you can maintain the fully funded balance throughout the first 10 years and subsequent 10 years of ownership. Now, if the roof was installed 5 years ago and you don't have anything in your current reserve balance, with a fully funded balance of $50,000, and that's what that purple line represents, and a reserve contribution of $10,000 per year, you can see that in year 5, the reserve fund expenses exceed the current reserve fund balance. So you have a significant deficit. And then in subsequent 10 years, the black bars indicate the ongoing deficit. Now, if the roof was also installed 5 years ago and your current reserve balance is $0, but you have a $50,000 special assessment in year 1, that brings the reserve balance up to the fully funded balance. And then continued contributions of $10,000 per year will maintain the balance in your reserve fund so that you can meet the expenses in year 5, 15, and 25. Now, what is the percent funded, and why is that important? Well, the percent funded is merely a ratio of the current reserve fund balance divided by the fully funded balance. And when you are developing a reserve funding plan, you need to calculate the percent funded ratio every year. And when the reserve cash is less than the component's deterioration, which is the case for most associations, the association is in a deficit situation. That is, the percent funded is less than 100%. Now, this is not necessarily bad, but the more extreme the deficit, the greater the likelihood of a special assessment. So, the percent funded is a key performance indicator, and it provides a very reliable measure year to year of the reserve fund to know if it's keeping pace, and it also provides a reliable predictor of the likelihood of special assessments. Now, here's some rules of thumb. Newer communities, you might be able to safely maintain a lower percent funding. Say values of 30 to 50% are not uncommon. Now, why? This is because in your reserve inventory, they're all pretty new. So being less than 100% or even significantly less may not be a high risk in the newer community. However, as the community ages, and a minimum ratio of 50% only becomes marginally acceptable, and if you're 40% or less, then you become very likely or have a high risk of a special assessment. Now, smaller communities tend to have less margin than others, so they might want to maintain a higher percent funding, say in the neighborhood of 80% or higher, while larger communities can absorb surprise expenses, and so they can maintain percent funding of even 60% or so. So, funding methods. There's really four. The first is full funding. This is the most conservative and has the lowest risk. The goal of full funding is to maintain your reserve balance at or very near to 100%, might even be more than 100%. This kind of funding has the highest cost or contribution rate. The next is called baseline funding, and this increases the risk of special assessments, and here's why. The actions are based on the average component cost, and this keeps the reserve balance above zero, but you tend not to have any contingency. Now, each individual component may not be fully funded, but since the reserve balance does not drop below zero, this is considered okay for baseline funding characteristics. But if you have a minor reduction in a component's remaining useful life, a little bit of a surprise, then the result can be a severe deficit in the reserve cash balance. Now, if an association was going to use baseline funding, it would absolutely require that you conduct annual reserve updates and field observations to evaluate the remaining useful life of all your components. The next is called statutory funding. This is based on local statutes and there is no contingency funding. This is just the bare minimum. Associations set aside a specific minimum amount of reserve as required by statutes. And the last is called threshold funding, and this balances risk with the cost of maintaining that reserve fund. Now, you obviously would keep the reserve fund above a certain amount, either a specified dollar amount or a percent funded amount, and this generally includes an analysis and awareness of the risk. So of those four, full funding and threshold funding are the recommended methods of funding your reserve fund. Baseline funding has no contingency, whereas threshold funding gives you some extra money in the bank, balancing risk to cost, and fully funded method is the maximum amount of extra money in the bank. Okay? Now, let's look at the further is one called straight line funding. Now, straight line funding is also called the component method. Now, in this method, it pretty much requires that you set a goal to 100% funded, and it's a very conservative approach. And because it's 100%, it's going to have a high contribution rate, but you'll have a very low risk of special assessments. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is that in straight line funding or component method, the reserves are essentially divided into separate funds for each component, and there's no commingling. So reserve fund contributions are calculated using the straight line method. They only can pursue the fully funded method or fully funding objective. Now, cash flow reserve funding is also called the pooled method. Now, in cash flow funding, the goal is to set a threshold level, which is typically less than 100%, which gives a lower contribution rate, but it increases the risk of a special assessment. But because the reserve fund is considered one large pool of money, then you have a lot of flexibility in how you can use that money. It's a shared resource, so the steady contribution rate will offset the scheduled reserve expenses from the fund no matter what project the expenses may have been designated for. Now, contributions are established by testing and retesting different contribution rates until you get to the desired funding objective. Now, I said before, now the cash flow method typically results in a lower rate of contributions, and the funds can be used more efficiently because those contributions are evenly spread over all the years. So what's the effect of percent funding and risk of special assessments? Well, typically you want to avoid special assessments. Minor surprises, however, should be expected. And special assessments are typically a consequence of when an association is surprised by something that's larger or earlier than expected, requiring money to be spent. Now, most special assessments are completely avoidable. Typical special assessments, for example, can be caused by painting, roofing, or roadway projects. And here in these green boxes, it says, it was not surprising that the roof failed. What was surprising was when it failed. And it was not only surprising how little reserves the association set aside towards the inevitable but predictable expense. So, in conclusion, minor surprises should be expected, but as long as you have a strong reserve fund, it'll better prepare you. All right, let's look at the effect percent funding has on the risk of special assessments. And there is a direct correlation between the risk of a special assessment and the reserve fund percent funded. Now here's a chart here. You can see that as the percent funding increases on the horizontal axis from 0 to above 100%, that the corresponding risk of a special assessment declines from very high to quite low. So if you use threshold funding method, and let's say you wanted to maintain a percent funding of between 60 to 80%, you can see that the risk of a special assessment at the 60 and 80% levels is low. And if you were to go above 80%, the decline in the risk of a special assessment improves, but that improvement is marginal. But if you go the other way, and you have less than 60%, you can see that the risk of a special assessment rises quite quickly. So now I want to look at the larger versus smaller communities. Now, in this chart here is some typical characteristics of a larger versus a smaller community. Larger communities have more reserve components. Their reserve fund is larger. Their risk tolerance for special assessments is higher in a larger community. So they can tolerate a higher risk than a lower community can, simply because they have less funding, or the smaller community has less funding. Now, the recommended percent funding threshold for communities that are more than 7 years old for a larger community is between 60 to 80%, whereas a smaller community would be wise to maintain a higher percent funding in the 80 to 100% range. Now, if the community is less than 5 years old, a larger community could very well deal with a percent funding in the 40 to 80% range, and whereas a smaller community would want to still maintain a higher percent funding even though they are a younger community. The recommended funding method for a larger community is almost always going to be a threshold type, whereas a smaller community may elect to have a threshold or a fully funded model. Now keep in mind, if your threshold is 100%, you're really fully funded. Larger communities generally don't need a contingency fund, whereas smaller communities might well be advised to have one. So, now these characteristics are purely general in nature and purely as a guideline, and so everybody must evaluate their own responsibilities and develop a funding plan that meets your own requirements. So in summary, well, choose a fully funded model or a threshold funding model plan for funding your expenses. And just to restate, fully funding is going to be more conservative and more costly in terms of contributions, but a threshold funding, if managed responsibly, will be less costly. If you are using a threshold funding model, you need to balance the cost with the risk of special assessments, and you also have to be sure you're meeting the statutory minimum requirements if they apply. Avoid baseline funding. This leaves too much margin for error. And also avoid statutory funding as that is only going to address a minimum amount of reserves. Now, you need to comply with local statutes, but purely complying with the minimum of local statutes is probably not a wise way to go. So for your consideration, choose threshold funding, perform regular reviews of your funding plan, and ensure that you're on track to meet your reserve component expenditures while maintaining a low risk. That pretty much wraps it up. I thank you for watching, and I encourage you to watch our other videos about the Reserve Funding Analyzer.